I'm David. I'll be telling you today about how we can leverage cryptographic tools for genome privacy. This talk is based on a lot of joint works with my advisor, Dan, as well as computational biologists here at Stanford, so Gil Bejarano, Karthik Jagadish, Johannes Bergemeyer, as well as biologists at MIT. This is Bonnie Berger's group and the student that's Hyun-Hoon Cho. Great. So the kinds of problems that we're interested in exploring in this space is problems like the following. What gene causes a specific rare disease? At first glance, it seems like a purely biology problem. So why is it at a security or privacy workshop? So allow me to explain. The setup is roughly as follows. Suppose we have a group of patients who all happen to have a particular genetic disorder. For this talk, take as a concrete example the case of Kabuki syndrome. So we have a group of patients who all happen to have Kabuki syndrome. Now let me also provide a little bit of biology background. The human genome consists of about 20,000 protein-encoding genes, genes that are actually responsible for dictating specific protein functionalities. And individuals, both you and I, as well as these patients in our group, have about 200 to 400 of these so-called rare variants, places in their genome that differ from the canonical reference human genome. So the way that we can abstractly model it is as follows. For each patient, we can associate with them a gene vector of dimension 20,000, one component associated with each gene in a protein-encoding genome. And each patient will have a 1 in a particular position if they have a rare variant in that gene and 0 otherwise. So once we formulated the problem in this way, the task of identifying the gene that is responsible for a particular disease is essentially identifying the gene that has the most common number of variants across all of the patients in the disease group. In this concrete example here, it would be gene number 2, because 4 out of the 5 patients in our disease group have a rare mutation in that particular gene. While this analysis might seem very simple, it actually tends to work surprisingly well for a very broad class of genetic diseases, namely the class of Mendelian or monogenic diseases, diseases that are caused by a mutation in a single gene. These diseases are actually quite common and are estimated to affect up to 10% of the population. So far, if we want to diagnose Mendelian diseases, it seems very straightforward. All we have to do is gather up a collection of patients who all happen to have the disease, sequence their genomes, and then perform this analysis where we identify the common gene. However, there are some complications in practice. Today, patients often live in geographically diverse areas. And because of the focus on rare diseases, any single medical institution or hospital might only have 1 or 2 patients. They don't have sufficient data to carry out the analysis needed. As a result, in order to perform these computations, patients essentially have to entrust their genome to some central facility or some trusted party who will then carry out this computation. Today, due to patient privacy concerns, as well as legal and regulatory barriers that exist that prevent institutions and facilities from directly sharing genomic data, these kinds of analyses are actually very difficult to carry out, and for good reason. A patient's genome is highly sensitive, and if revealed, not only compromises their own individual privacy, but also the privacy of their relatives and their next of kin, and can open them up to subsequent fraud or discrimination. As such, the natural question that the biologists came to us with is whether we can hope to perform these kinds of computations, but alleviate some of these privacy concerns. Can we perform these useful scientific computations but without getting direct access to the complete patient genomes of all of the different individuals? Here, the problem becomes a cryptographic one. And in this talk, I will tell you about how modern cryptographic tools enable us to address these scientific challenges. Using cryptography, the solution will look roughly as follows. We're going to first assume that we have access to 2 entities that don't oftentimes collude with one another. For instance, you can consider a hospital in the United States and a hospital in Europe. And once we have these 2 non-colluding entities, it actually becomes much easier to make progress on this problem. What we can do is something along the following. Each patient will take their genome and do what's called a secret sharing of their genome and send each share to each of these 2 hospitals. What this means concretely is the following. Each patient will generate a random vector and send it to one of the hospitals, so the random vector has nothing to do with their genome. And to the other hospital, it will send a difference between the random vector and their genome. So notice that in a very strong information theoretic sense, each individual hospital learns absolutely no information about the contents of any individual genome. Of course, together, they're able to reconstruct the full information. And that's what is going to enable us to perform useful computations on that data. So in this way, all of the patients in our disease group will contribute and secret share their data across the 2 institutions. And after all of the data has been aggregated, what the two hospitals are going to do is engage in what's called a cryptographic multi-party computation protocol, or MPC protocol, on the pooled inputs. What this essentially entails is a message passing protocol. So these two hospitals are going to exchange a sequence of messages such that at the end of the protocol execution, what they each of them learn is basically the top most frequently occurring variant across all of the patients in a disease group. When we actually perform these kinds of computations on actual patient data, we're able to successfully reconstruct and identify the known cause of the disease. Moreover, the security and privacy requirements that we can then satisfy is that all of the hospitals and all of the patients only learn these single or the top 2 or 3 variants that are most common across all of them. They do not learn the other 200 to 400 rare variants that any patient might have that might serve as a genetic fingerprint for that patient. All that information is highly sensitive and is kept completely confidential as a result of these computations. The techniques I described here actually are applicable more broadly to many different scenarios. So I started by describing one such scenario where we have this group of patients, and our goal is to identify a causal gene that afflict all of these different patients. But we can also consider other scenarios in the genomic space where our techniques apply equally well. For instance, we might have two hospitals who might want to identify to see if they have any patients with common rare mutations or rare variants. This might allow them to develop common treatment plans and so forth to facilitate the diagnosis and treatment of complex diseases. In other cases, we might have analyses where we want to find a mutation that appears in a child but not in any of the patients. Again, cryptographic techniques enable us to perform these kinds of useful scientific computations. And again, all of these examples might seem very simple, but to showcase that this is actually a very useful scientific computation, let me emphasize that using our techniques, we were actually able to discover a previously unidentified pathological variant, and subsequent tests with biologists at the Stanford School of Medicine was actually able to confirm that we actually made a useful and relevant scientific discovery. So these techniques, if deployed, can essentially and significantly improve the amount of patient privacy we can get and still facilitate these very useful scientific computations. Let me just briefly say a few words about the efficiency of our protocol. To simulate these two non-colluding cloud entities, we basically set up one server on the East Coast and one server on the West Coast of the US, and we basically measured the amount of time and computation needed in order to run one of these protocols for identifying the causal gene across a small disease cohort. What you can see is for a modest number of patients, somewhere between 10 and 100, our protocol is quite efficient. Namely, the computation, the end-to-end protocol execution time basically is under 20 seconds, and only a modest amount of communication is needed on the orders of tens of megabytes. Let me preface here that for many cases where we have rare diseases, small disease cohorts is actually sufficient to perform these analyses. In all of our concrete experiments, 5 to 10 patients was actually sufficient. And for these types of scenarios, our protocols are highly efficient and serve to make the necessary scientific discoveries. Now, you might wonder, everything I've talked about so far is related to rare disease diagnosis. But what if we want to understand the genetics of cancer or find the genetic causes of more common phenotypes like high blood pressure? So in a subsequent work with folks at MIT, we looked at performing even much larger scale analyses to also identify the genetic causes of more complex diseases and conditions like high blood pressure or cancer and so forth. The genetic tool that's often used here is what's called a genome-wide association studies, or GWAS for short. And oftentimes the focus is on identifying the complex interactions that underlie things like cancer and other more common diseases. There are many challenges that arise when we have to extend our multi-party computation frameworks to handle a large number of patients and tease out these more complex and weaker signals. For instance, oftentimes we have to work with upwards of 10,000 to over 1 million individuals in order to actually obtain useful scientific results. We also oftentimes have to correct for population-level effects, because when we have millions of individuals and millions of patients, sometimes deviations could just be caused by one's ancestry. These could cause large correlations with the disease status, but actually are not actually responsible for the condition we're exploring. So we have to develop algorithmic techniques to filter out these kinds of population-level effects and develop them in a way that's amenable to modern cryptographic tools. I won't have time to go into the details. Let me just give you the high-level conclusion. Our work actually gives the first end-to-end protocol to perform these kinds of genome-wide association studies. For about 25,000 individuals, we were able to complete this entire protocol with about 3 days of computation. This might seem like a lot, but when you consider typical scientific computations, to just get access to the data oftentimes takes 90 days or something like that. So when we are able to perform useful scientific studies that are able to identify genetic causes of certain diseases, computing in something like 3 days is actually well within this realm of reason. So the high-level takeaway that I want you to understand from the first part of this talk is that using modern cryptographic tools, we can actually enable useful computations while protecting and maintaining the privacy of the individual genomes that go into these kinds of computations. Let me also emphasize here that I'm really just using genomics as one particular use case of a more general paradigm in cryptography. But very often, the techniques that we develop and use here can actually be applied to very general computations over private data. So if you have scenarios, for instance, in machine learning or in the IoT space, where you actually need to do computations on private data, many of our techniques here can actually be useful, and I'm very happy to talk to you about those if you're interested. So in the remaining time I have left, I'm going to demystify and show you some of the magic that goes on in constructing these cryptographic protocols. How do we do computations on private inputs? And as the one concrete example that I'm going to give you is this Yao's protocol for doing two-party computation. This is a beautiful protocol due to Andrew Yao, and it dates back even to the 1980s. So it's very impressive that a lot of these protocols and these ideas were really around since the dawn of cryptography, and today they're actually being applicable and useful for addressing a lot of the privacy challenges we face today. So Yao's protocol is a classic protocol for two-party computation. Namely, there are two computing parties, and they each have some private inputs. Maybe we have two hospitals, and these are the vectors they hold are sort of the rare variants that occur among the patients within that hospital. And their goal is to compute some joint function on their private inputs such that at the end of the computation, the only thing that is revealed to the two hospitals is the results of the computation and whatever can be inferred from those results. So if the computation itself is very leaky or reveals a lot of information, perhaps we should not be performing those kinds of computations. But if we design the computation carefully, we have designed a reasonable mechanism that provides a valid privacy and functionality trade-off, we can actually perform these computations without revealing any additional information. Let me now describe for you how this protocol execution works. Typically, we're going to denote one of the parties as the garbler and one of them as the evaluator. The reasons for these names will become clear subsequently in this talk. Let me just note here that Yao's protocol is also called a garbled circuit protocol. So if you've heard that name before, this is what it's referring to. So in the first step of the computation, what we're going to do is we're going to model that computation as a Boolean circuit. So we're going to express it as a sequence of logic gates, where the inputs to this Boolean circuit are the inputs of each of the individual parties. So some of the wires here labeled in green are pertaining to party 1, and some that are labeled in orange are held by party number 2. So the output of the computation is going to be computed by this logic circuit. And the second step of the protocol now is one of these designated parties, namely the garbler, is going to essentially prepare an encryption of the circuit, or a garbling of the circuit, and it's going to be done in a very special way to enable the evaluator to subsequently learn the output of the computation on the input of its choosing. The way it works is as follows. The garbler is going to start by choosing two different symmetric encryption keys for every wire in the circuit, right? So we have a bunch of input wires, we have intermediate wires, and then we have output wires. So first, the garbler is going to choose two encryption keys for the first wire of the circuit, and it's going to proceed likewise. So every single wire in the circuit has two different keys associated with it. Why two keys? Well, essentially, each key is going to be associated with a particular value that can be the value of that particular wire. Right? We're talking about Boolean circuits, so that means all of the inputs are binary values, they're 0, 1 values, and all of the intermediate wires, as you sort of evaluate each gate of the circuit, is also a 0, 1 value. So each key can essentially be associated with one single wire value. That's why we have two keys for each wire, one for the value 0 for that wire, one for the value 1 for that particular wire. So now let me describe for you how we actually encrypt or garble each of the gates in the circuit. The protocol is going to proceed gate by gate. So every gate is going to be prepared as follows. Let's focus on one particular gate, an AND gate. First, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the truth table for this AND gate. So just to recall, in an AND gate, the output wire is 1 if and only if both of the input wires are equal to 1. So on the right half of the slide, I've written down the truth table of the AND gate, where the inputs are contributed by parties 1 and 2, and the output is just the AND of the 2 input bits. Now recall that for every wire in the circuit, I've associated with them 2 different keys. Okay, so I'm going to just write down the keys associated with the input wires as well as the output wires. And the key idea now is we're essentially going to encrypt the output key with the 2 input keys. Okay, so let me show you this as a picture. Let's take the first row in this truth table. So both inputs are 0. The output is also 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to encrypt the key associated with the value 0 for the output wire, here denoted by K0 out. And we're going to encrypt it using the 2 keys corresponding to the input values. So party 1's input value is 0. Party 2's input value is also 0. And we're going to proceed likewise. So for every row in the truth table, we're going to produce a ciphertext, and the ciphertext is going to be encrypted using 2 different keys, where the choice of the 2 keys depends on the corresponding values for those input wires. And now we're simply going to shuffle the rows of this table randomly. Okay? So we're going to randomly permute the ordering of the ciphertexts for each garbled table. Now observe, how do we do evaluation? What we're going to do is we're going to somehow, I haven't explained how, but give the evaluator this garbled table, as well as ensure that the evaluator only has a single key for every single input wire for the circuit. Now notice that if the evaluator has a single key for each wire, it can decrypt exactly 1 of the rows in this table, namely the row corresponding to its particular input configuration. In this case, the evaluator has the key for the bit 1 for party 1's input, for the green input, and the bit 0 for party 2's input. So it is able to decrypt the first row of this table. So what that looks like is the evaluator takes its key, it unlocks the first ciphertext, and then it unlocks the second component, and out pops the output key. So if we ensure that the evaluator has exactly 1 key for every wire in the input layer, the construction of the garbling process ensures that the evaluator can essentially learn 1 key for every wire in the intermediate circuit as well as the output circuit. And this is what allows the evaluator to perform the evaluation process. Notice that when the evaluator obtains the output key, the output value, this is just a random symmetric key, just another cryptographic key. It has no semantic meaning. The key itself does not say the value is 0. So essentially what the evaluator can do is it obtains a new key, but it doesn't really know whether this key corresponds to the value 0 or the value 1. And this is how we're going to get privacy. Okay? So the overall protocol will roughly go as follows. The garbler is going to prepare its garbled circuits, and it's going to send the garbled tables as well as the keys for its input to the evaluator. There's one more step that's missing here. How does the evaluator obtain the keys for its input? Because the evaluator also participates in the computation, it needs to provide some set of keys in order to actually decrypt the entries in these garbled tables and compute the responses. So there's one final ingredient, which is the notion of an oblivious transfer protocol. I'm just going to describe it abstractly here. I'm not going to give you the concrete details. But roughly what the setup is as follows. Here we have a garbler. The garbler chose 2 keys for every wire in the circuit. So for all of the wires that are contributed by the other party, by the evaluator, it has 2 keys. But it doesn't know which key to give to the evaluator, because that depends on the evaluator's input. So what an oblivious transfer protocol does is it enables the evaluator to choose exactly 1 of the 2 keys. And in particular, it allows it to obtain a single key for its chosen input. So in this case, if the evaluator's input is the value 1, it is going to request the 1 key. So an oblivious transfer protocol enables precisely that computation. It allows the evaluator to obtain the key corresponding to its input, namely the key 1 for this concrete example, while ensuring that the garbler learns no information about which key the evaluator chose. So in this way, we can actually implement a secure computation protocol for arbitrary functionalities as follows. So in the first round of the protocol, the evaluator is going to send an OT message or an oblivious transfer message asking for the keys corresponding to its input. And then the garbler is going to reply with the garbled circuit gates. It's going to reply with the keys for its input. And then finally, the responses to the oblivious transfer query that enables the evaluator to learn the keys for its input, revealing no additional information to the garbler. Then the evaluator can simply use these keys. Every time it has the keys for the inputs, it can obtain the key for the output, and it can proceed likewise gate by gate through the circuit, eventually receiving the output. This is a very basic description of Yao's protocol. In the ensuing 35 years since the introduction of Yao's protocol, many improvements have been proposed. And today, this is actually a highly efficient protocol that enables many different kinds of secure computation. So protocol is extremely efficient. The main bottleneck today is in terms of the communication. So the unfortunate thing is that the garbled circuit can be very, very big, right? Because if you think about it, every single gate in the circuit consists of a small number of ciphertexts. And this can quickly add up depending on the magnitude and the complexity of the computation of interest. But the evaluation time and the garbling time is actually very fast. So just to come back to the original picture, I hope I sort of demystified some of what goes on in these multi-party computation protocols. So using these kinds of protocols and these kinds of tools, we can actually enable useful computations while retaining the privacy of individual genomic data. For instance, in our scenarios, we oftentimes represent the computation as a Boolean circuit, and then we run an instantiation of Yao's protocol. For other scenarios, such as the large-scale genome-wide association problem, we use different multi-party computation protocols. And these will vary depending on the nature of the computation, what kind of protocols we would like to use to achieve what kind of efficiency and performance constraints. So again, as a high-level picture, I hope I've demonstrated to you that using some of these new kinds of cryptographic techniques, we can actually perform useful scientific computations while preserving the privacy of the underlying genomic data. And to conclude, if you're interested in learning more, our paper is available. It was published in Science earlier last year. We have a complete implementation if you're interested in exploring and playing around with the code. And there will be an upcoming paper appearing in Nature Biotech, hopefully this month or next month, on doing the large-scale privacy-preserving genome-wide association studies. Thank you very much.
I have to say that David is my first student to actually graduate with papers in science and biotech. It's very, very cool. Any questions on this?
So for the protocol that you're using for the genome-wide study,
yes.
Is it secure again? Does it require that every party defect, or what's the guarantees on the number of defectors you tolerate?
Right. So in all of these protocols, we work in this so-called two-cloud scenario, where all of the parties will secret share their data to these two cloud servers, and they're trusted not to collude. So it's possible that one of the clouds is malicious, but as long as they're not sharing their data, then we have security. Right. And certainly in subsequent works, we're trying to relax that model and get stronger security. But this is sort of the first step.
For the second part, the genome-wide association study, did you just use the secure multi-party computation or also differential privacy? And if so, how do these two methods compare scaling property?
Right, it's an excellent question. So for the focus of this work, we were looking at primarily cryptographic solutions. So there's been a lot of other work also by the same lab at MIT. So Bonnie Berger's group does a lot of work on this, looking at using differential privacy techniques also for GWAS. So these provide different kinds of trade-offs. And I think one of the nice things about it is that differential privacy is also very compatible with the cryptographic framework. So we can add noise either at the beginning or at the end of the computations in order to also implement a differential privacy mechanism on top of the cryptography. So these are not mutually exclusive, and they provide different kinds of security guarantees. So for GWAS, I think differential privacy and crypto both are valid tools. For the first task of doing these rare disease diagnoses, differential privacy is less suitable because we often have very small number of patients, and we're really looking for those rare events.
So what's the limits of this? Are there things you want to do that you can't do using these techniques?
Well, so these techniques themselves are very general. So in principle, we can do arbitrary computations. The question is, what kinds of computations can we do efficiently? And there, I think we need a lot of more communication between, at least for the genomic space, between the computational biologists who sort of propose the kinds of computations they would like to do, and the cryptographers sort of saying, what kind of computations can we do efficiently? And I think the most interesting research is sort of finding that interesting middle ground where we can do useful scientific computations, but also at a scale that enables useful scientific discoveries.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.